Welcome back to another Daily Dose of History and part 2 of our Civil War series. If you missed part 1, here's a quick recap for you. Due to opposing views on the concept of slavery, the northern states and the southern states thought that they could solve it by starting a war. The northern states were considered the Union, and they were fighting to free the slaves from the south and to keep all of the states under one united country. This was a pretty diverse army that consisted of mostly farmers, but also European immigrants and African Americans. At first, President Abraham Lincoln struggled to find solid leadership, but then he discovered Ulysses S. Grant and decided to make him the general of the Union Army. We'll talk more about him in part 4 of this series. As for the opposition, the southern states called themselves the Confederates. They were fighting in the Civil War to keep the slave industry alive, and they were doing this because many Southerners owned massive plantations and believed that it was important to keep African Americans as their slaves so that they could do the work and the Southerners would get rich. Their army consisted of mostly poor white men, and they did offer slaves freedom if they fought on the Confederate side, but unfortunately they never fulfilled this promise once the war was over. And this Confederate army was led by Robert E. Lee, who at first was asked to lead the Union Army, but then settled for the Confederate Army after Virginia, his home state, aligned themselves with the Confederate points of view. Fighting continued for a few years until the Union Army scored some major victories on their home turf. One such victory was the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. Now, both armies lost a lot of men, but it was considered a victory for the Union because they caused the Confederate Army to retreat. And it also allowed President Lincoln to declare his Emancipation Proclamation, which made slavery illegal. So now on to today's topic. You'll notice that I forgot to address the Battle of Gettysburg here, but that's because I wanted to use it as an example for what we're going to be talking about in our video today. This battle, along with many other battles in the Civil War, created a massive amount of death, and it was mostly due to the fact that new technology and new tactics were created. For example, in earlier wars, generals had often won battles by attacking enemies head-on with larger armies. Both sides used this tactic during the Civil War, but defenders used several other tactics to fight off large forces. Defending troops tried to find high ground so they could fire down on their attackers. Defenders also dug trenches, or deep ditches, or built dirt walls to be used as cover while they fired at the enemy. If attackers had to cross open ground, they would suffer many casualties. And that's exactly what happened during the Battle of Gettysburg with Pickett's charge. Robert E. Lee had 15,000 of his men go straight up the middle of a wide open field for almost 3/4 of a mile, which, as we just read, led to a massive wipeout of Confederate soldiers. And in addition to that, before Pickett's charge, the Confederate Army chased the Union up to the high ground, which gave the Union an advantage. But besides new tactics, this war also brought about new technology and weaponry. New weapons helped defenders, most notably the rifle. Rifles were more accurate over longer distances than traditional muskets. Now, defenders could shoot attackers before they got close. They could also fire deadly artillery, large, heavy guns like cannons, at attackers. As a result, many bloody battles were no longer decided by troop numbers. In fact, battles often had no clear winner. This is a musket, and it was the type of gun used during the Revolutionary War. And this bottom picture here is a rifle that was used during the Civil War. As you can see, both of these pictures are pretty similar. But this gun here is a lot longer, and the inside of it is spiraled, which makes the bullet a lot more controlled when it's fired. Which helps because, as the text said, it allowed the soldiers to fight at a further distance. Many cannons were also used during this war and caused way more destruction than just guns did. And something tells me I probably wouldn't last long. But wait, there's more. In addition to newer weapons, there was also newer modes of transportation and communication. Other new technologies also made the Civil War deadly. Railroads helped armies move quickly, especially in the North. The South began using the telegraph to send messages over long distances, and Union spies watched enemy movements from hot air balloons. For the first time, ships with iron plating fought each other at sea. Paul Revere wishes this stuff was available. Probably would have saved him a lot of time on his ride through Massachusetts warning them that the British was coming. The point here is that the country was growing, and as more states were being added, more technology was needed to communicate between further distances. And so it makes a lot of sense that this war became more deadly. If you could travel from point A to point B in 2 days instead of 2 weeks, then obviously there's going to be a lot more bloodshed. And these fights were anything but glamorous. The sheer number of deaths alone was bad enough. But that was expected given the kinds of conditions that these people fought in. Civil War combat was both frightening and dangerous. Attacks on enemy positions usually started with fire from artillery guns, which filled the air with deafening noises and clouds of black smoke. Often, troops were blinded by the smoke and could only hear the action around them. So basically, before even the real fighting began, the soldiers could barely hear anything around them. With all the cannon fire surrounding them, it was like you were standing right in front of the biggest 4th of July fireworks show that you could possibly think of. But listen to this. And that is how the Union won the Civil War. Don't worry, if you didn't catch that, we'll address it in part 4. But as a quick recap, it went sort of like this. Okay, then after their eardrums were basically gone, they then marched to battle with this drum tune that you're hearing above me talking right now. The idea behind this drum beat was to rally the troops and make them more confident as they went into battle. And they even created various musical sounds and rhythms in order to represent different commands that they definitely wouldn't be able to hear if a human had shouted them. So not only are your ears ringing from the cannon fire, you also have to deal with the drum noises as you're marching into battle. This is already uncomfortable enough, but then take a look at just how tightly packed their formations were when they were marching. By marching like this, it made it easy for the enemy on either side to take down soldiers before they even reached the front lines. And when they did reach the other side, things got real bad. Nearing enemy lines, the attacking troops placed bayonets on their rifles. Then they charged toward their opponents, who were firing at them from cover. The soldiers, used to short-range muskets, sometimes waited too long to fire more advanced rifles. When the two sides drew close, men fought face-to-face. Opposing soldiers were just a few feet apart at this point, and often only one shot was fired. Fighters used their bayonets and the butts of their rifles to spear or club the enemy. The key thing to remember about this war is that it was a war between the same people. It's one thing if you're engaged in battle with another country who's threatening your livelihood, but that wasn't the case for the Civil War. This war was purely raw emotions and lack of civil discourse between two groups of people. They would rather fight it out than talk it out, and this is precisely why these battles were so vicious. On either side, people were going to do whatever it took to get the upper hand. These battles were far from pretty and were some of the most brutal and messiest fights in any war Americans have fought in. And they were doing it against themselves. If there was an opportunity to strike down their enemy, they took it. And at the end of these battles, there were countless soldiers lying in the fields waiting to die from pain from their injuries or dehydration. This was far from an honorable war. But guys, that's going to do it for today's Daily Dose of History and part 2 of our Civil War series. Be sure to tune in next week on Tuesday for part 3 of our series as we discuss how these soldiers were taken care of in the field of battle and what they ate and drank. I'll give you a hint. It's not Takis. So with that being said, I will see you right here on Tuesday.